morning, everyone. I take great pleasure in welcoming you today to our session on open government data. My name is Vishal Mutta. I'm part of the organizing committee at IQPC Australia and would firstly opportunity to thank our stellar speakers from the government and education sector across Australia and New Zealand, and our event partners Click for supporting this initiative this morning and even making it possible. I do have some quick housekeeping announcements that I'd like to run you through before we get things underway. Throughout each presentation, you will have the opportunity to submit questions to our speakers to answer live at the end of the session. You can do this by using the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. I also encourage you to ask as many questions as you can possibly ask, and our speakers will just endeavor to respond to them either post the session itself or offline. I'd also like to remind you that you will get access to the on-demand recordings for this session. There's also a resource center that you can access if you see at the bottom of your screen. It's got white papers and some other resources that Click has made available around data strategy, capability, and culture to help you build on your knowledge of effectively harnessing the power of data. So I encourage you to go on and take a look. Also, at the end of the session, each session this morning, please click on the back to the event timeline button on the top of your screen to access the link for the next session that will kick off. Lastly, if you had any technical issues throughout the session itself, please submit your inquiry within the Q&A box, and I'll be able to respond to you along with the team and help you out. That said, I'd like to now introduce you for a chair for this morning, Jason Wago. Jason's the Chair and Regional Director of Queensland at GovHack Australia, and he'll take charge of proceedings. A little bit about Jason. Jason works at the University of Queensland in the Centre of Energy, Data and Innovation as a research officer, whilst finalizing his PhD in co-located collaboration in mixed reality. He's been involved with GovHack since the first GovHack in Queensland that took place in 2013, starting as a participant and in subsequent years becoming more and more involved as a volunteer. Jason has then gone on to become an event host, the state director, and competition director, in addition to being on the board as well. Jason has interest in teaching, design, open collaboration, visualizations, and extended reality. Jason, pleasure to have you here, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Vish. Thank you for inviting me to share this event looking at open data within Australia and New Zealand. I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers this morning. Before we get started, I would like to pay my respects to the Yagara people, the traditional custodians of the land where I am streaming from. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from where you are all watching, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Across Australia and New Zealand, there are about 60,000 open government data sets available on their respective data portals. These data portals launched in 2009 with a total of just 300 data sets. There's been a massive increase over the 11 years to bring us to where we are today. More and more is being released every year and being made available for public use. These data sets, while valuable, are not, however, sensitive data sets. The secure and transparent sharing of sensitive data, which has been appropriately anonymized between government departments and agencies and authorized organizations such as research institutions, can lead to data-led innovations for the benefit of both the public and communities as a whole. GovHack Australia and its sibling organisation, GovHack Aotearoa New Zealand, organises an annual open government data hackathon that this year will be taking place on the weekend of the 20th to the 22nd of August across Australia and New Zealand. Through the hackathon, GovHack promotes and encourages the use and release of non-sensitive government data that can be used to address issues facing our communities. Each year, we see participants from all walks of life coming together to explore open government data and develop ideas and proof of concepts. Last year, we saw ideas and proof of concepts looking at topics such as recovery and resilience, given the national and international events of the Australian bushfires and the COVID-19 pandemic, among many other topics. Following the hackathon weekend, judges from our sponsoring organisations, such as national, state, and local governments, review each of the entries in their relevant topics to determine the winning entries. In doing so, they get to see the creative and intuitive and industrious applications and ideas that have been developed by our participants. Previous entries have gone on to be developed into products independently and with government departments working with the teams. This is a great example of the value of open government data. This morning, I will hear from a number of leaders from across Australia and New Zealand in the areas of open government data, talking about ways in which value can be generated from high-value sensitive data through secure access and sharing of government data. During these talks, we encourage you to think of and ask questions during the Q&A, which will be following each presentation. Our first presentation this morning will be a panel chaired by Sam Nielsen, who is the Director of Performance and Analytics at the New South Wales Public Service Commission. The topic that we will be exploring during this panel is from promise to value creation, overcoming challenges with creating, scaling, and sustaining value creation from open public sector data assets. Dr. Sam Nielsen is the Director of Performance and Analytics in the New South Wales Public Service Commission. His responsibilities have consistently involved using strategy, analytics, and data science to ensure an organisation has insightful and empowering evidence to optimise success in key decisions and transformations. He works in the higher education sector for more than 20 years as a researcher, administrator, and manager. He has previously developed and led the Strategic Intelligence Unit, International Strategy Unit, and the Department of Reporting and Analysis at the Queensland University of Technology. He has used his analysis and research skills in various consultancies with NGOs. Dr. Nielsen has higher education degrees in IT, physics, psychology, education, and disaster management. So over to you now, Sam.
Hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was asked to come a little bit later to this event, actually, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I was mentioning to the rest of the panel that a particular interest of mine at the moment is around building a data strategy. I work in the New South Wales Public Service Commission, and as part of what we're doing, we're refreshing our strategy at the moment. I look after the workforce data that we report on. And really, we need to do a lot more with that in terms of its openness and what we can do with that information. So I'm really excited to be here today and to hear some of the comments. I'm going to introduce the other panel members or ask them to introduce themselves. I'll just mention that at the moment, Ian Opperman hasn't arrived just yet, so we'll just follow up on that in the background. I'm going to proceed with the event. and we'll do some catch up if he manages to turn up along the way. That will allow us a bit of greater depth from the other panel members that are here, but as well, it does mean that we might be able to take a couple more questions and have a bit more interactive conversation as well. But we'll just see, and hopefully Ian's just running slightly behind, and hopefully is okay too. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to mention the names of the two panel members here and ask them to give a bit of a background, and then we'll get into some set questions and then go from there. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Jason Weigel. Thank you. Oh, well, you've already met him, so I don't know if you want to add anything else, Jason.
No, I'm good. I'll pass over to for Spiel.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So the other panel member here is Amy Whitcroft. Over to you, Amy.
Kia ora all. Can you hear me?
Yes, fantastic.
Excellent. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me join in the conversation. I've been really excited about it. And thank you to everybody who's joined in. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and the conversations we're going to be having. So my name is Amy Whitcroft. I'm currently Open Data Lead at Waka Kotahi New Zealand Transport Agency, which, as you may have guessed from the name, is in New Zealand. And I'm heavily involved in, as you may imagine, open data, both in the transport sector and beyond, and around open data and open government and all things open. I just call it Open X, like open stuff, humanities and science and code, and for many years now. And funny story, I used to be involved with GovHack New Zealand, what is now GovHack Aotearoa, and helped lead it for a while. So as you can tell, open data folks and open government folks tend to be quite heavily connected across the world. It's a great group of people. I'm also an advisory board member for the Open Data Charter that some of you all may be familiar with. If you're not, head over to or go and look up on your favorite search engine, Open Data Charter. They do amazing work with governments all over the world. And I'm also a counsellor for Internet New Zealand, but most of my time at the moment is taken thinking about open data in the transport sector and what we can do to improve the situation.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to get us started with first question. I might start with you, Amy, and then we'll go to Jason. Can each of you comment on how your department has made progress around open data over the last couple of years and where you're looking to go with it? Noting, Jason, that you're looking into the government from alongside and can comment from that perspective as well. So, Amy?
Thank you for that. So Waka Kotahi, for example, has been releasing open data now for a number of years and releases a lot of it. It's really exciting. A couple of years ago, in fact, almost exactly 2 years ago, in about April of this year, it'll be exactly 2 years, they decided we need an open data lead in the agency. We know that we could do better. We could be perhaps a bit more structured about what we do. And they brought me on board to help frame up, quite literally, an open data framework for the agency, think about some processes and some tools we could use to start improving the situation. So that's where they started to think about how to do it differently. In that couple of years, we've expanded the team. It's not just me now. And of course, we don't do all of the open data releases ourselves. We work with our subject matter experts and data stewards and business owners across the whole agency because we have so much data and so much really, really exciting data. So that's one of the things we've done. As I said, we came up with a framework and some toolkits and processes. We published those under a CC BY license in October 2019 openly. And we're in the process, of course, of re-looking at those, seeing how we can iterate and optimize on them. And I'm sure we'll re-release when we do. Other things, we've, of course, been publishing open data sets. We've been doing more sort of API type-based data sets so that people can plug directly into things like traffic counts across our state highways. You can imagine that people both in government agencies are very interested in that, especially over the last year or so. But we've also seen the private sector be very interested in some of those data sets to help them inform things like investment decisions. And of course, community groups are always in our minds as to how we can help. We've formed a transport sector open data working group. So other government agencies, both local and central, have been invited to be a part of that. And we're working on how to align our efforts where we can across the transport sector in ways that make sense. Both to do things like create an open data set of high-level principles that we can all follow and point to and use to motivate the work that we do. And I don't want to say sell it, but sell it to various people to get them on board, including sometimes our upper management and so forth. We are also working on, we have benchmarked our maturity as well across the organizations in the working group. so that we can start to align our efforts on our maturity uplifts, again, wherever makes sense and where we can, because we're not into wheel reinvention, which is always a bad pun in the transport sector, but nonetheless, that's what it is. And we're doing things like forming up user groups to allow continuous user engagement and conversation with our users so that we can build communities, share not just data, but code blobs and knowledge and all of that sort of stuff. And there's a whole bunch of other things, but those would be, I think, some of the highlight and sort of efforts that we've been doing over the past couple of years, as well as maturing our back-end systems and things as well.
Fantastic. That's excellent. Great news. Ian here as well now. So before we go to you, Jason, what I'll just do, Ian, is get you to quickly introduce yourself. And then if you could, as part of that, jump into this question on the fly about some progress that your department might have made over the last couple of years around open data and what some of your plans might be for the near future.
So my apologies for being a little late. Technical challenges. Ian Opperman, New South Wales Government Chief Data Scientist, also Industry Professor at the University of Technology. It's been a great year for data. In fact, 2020 was the best year we've ever had for data. Apart from the pandemic itself, it gave people real clarity and focus and purpose around data. And the ability for people to use non-traditional data sets really opened people's eyes to the value of casting a wider net. So all of that's actually led to New South Wales rethinking its data strategy. So we're right in the middle of the process right now to put in place a data strategy which captures some of the benefits, but also some of the things we learned around the importance of governance and the limitations as well as the benefits of data. So we learned a lot in 2020, and a lot of that's being baked into the new strategy now.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you, Ian. Jason.
So, as you said earlier, and as I said, GovHack isn't a government department. We are running on the outside, looking into government. We're independent companies that try to promote and encourage governments to release more and more open data that is non-sensitive and is appropriately de-identified, so that the general public can make use of it. So we work closely with government entities to curate challenges that are facing our communities from year to year, and we encourage them to release or where possible, speed up the release of some data appropriate for challenges from one year to another. From the other perspective, we are also starting to release data ourselves, where on our websites we have, you can see all the data sets that participants have used during the competition, so that, and we keep that record available. So government entities can always go back and see how data is being used in GovHack projects, which are developed over 48 hours, and then continue to go on. We're trying to make it easier for government entities to go through and actually can pick up specific data sets for their organization rather than just going through the full listing. They can drill down to their specific organization to see how their data is being used, so that they can see how value is being drawn from the effort they're doing for releasing all this data.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot of activity going on at the moment, as we've noted. There's a lot of promise and activity going forward. As part of that, I'd like to turn our attention to how we identify critical assets for the government that possess the maximum promise. And I'm interested to know how we make sure we identify and release assets that the public can truly benefit from. So I might start with you, Ian, if that's all right, and then I'll go to Amy and Jason. Thanks.
So, one of the things that happened during the course of 2020 was that there was a great increase in not only the awareness of value of data, but also the maturity in terms of appropriate processing, appropriate governance, appropriate handling of data, And when people step outside of their normal conventional data zones and start talking about linking transport or telco or credit card data to their traditional data sets, that appreciation of the value goes up, but also the appreciation of the need for strong governance goes up. And what we've ultimately settled on, or where we are settling on, is a better understanding of the need to think about the use of data across its entire life cycle, from capture and how it's captured, the consent it's captured with the provenance up to the point where it's actually used, and then the appropriate use of those data-driven insights and how they will be used and what other use cases they exist for them. So all of that means that we're thinking now about use of data from very closed and trusted environments to all the way through to the greater release of data to the public. And we've been building frameworks of governance which consider use of very sensitive and personal data, use of data which is not sensitive and personal, use of data which is personal and not sensitive, and use of data which we're putting in the outside world, and as well as thinking about how we maintain as much of the utility as possible of those different data use cases as we go along. So in terms of our entire thinking about data has taken some big steps up in maturity and sophistication during the course of the year, which will lead to greater release of open data and will hopefully continue to allow people to use a richer set of and variety of data and greater insights, but with greater care and understanding of all the different stages along that journey.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ian. Amy?
Kia ora. I was just unmuting myself. Sometimes you hear trains and things coming past and trucks and big tractors and things. Anyway, so thank you. And Ian, I wanted to say big ups for mentioning the importance of data governance there. I think it's absolutely key and something that people are starting, I think, to put the required amount of attention and effort and resource into, because it's not simple, but it's the bedrock for everything else. So thank you for that. I would say that something that often gets left out of conversations where people say, what sort of data should we be releasing, is actually talking directly with the public, user engagement. And it's not just the public. We release data for ourselves as well. You know, open data can help organizations access and improve their own data internally, which is something people can sometimes forget about. But true user engagement, so that's more than potentially putting out a survey or having an email address. This is why we're setting up user groups in Waka Kotahi and then for the sector to say, at any point you can get in touch with us. We want to hear from you, not only what data you want, but we want to hear what you want to do with it, what you are doing with it. We want to hear what formats and standards would be most useful for you, because that starts to enable conversations about interoperability. What sort of documentation is useful for you? Do you need very, very hardcore data dictionaries, or do you need a simple description? If it's an API, how much do we need to document? I would say all of that is really key. Excuse me. And there's this idea now of open by default is still very much there, but has often caused some confusion and some issues for people. So I know in the Open Data Charter and more widely, we're starting to speak about publish with purpose. So that doesn't mean a closed by default approach. It means that we don't have access to every mind and every person on earth to be not only publishing open data sets, but, maintaining them, updating them, improving them, measuring against them, and all that sort of stuff. What do we really want to prioritize? What is the stuff that is going to have maximum utility? Again, we only learn that through ongoing korero, through conversation with the people who are using the data and or want to use the data, but can't, for example. And I just wanted to say another thing here is this becomes especially important also as people are thinking about stuff like data justice, data equity, data rights, indigenous data sovereignty. And also it's not just about data, it's about algorithms, for example. It's about how do we collect the information, confidentialization, I'm sure we'll talk about that later, and so much more. But if we aren't speaking with people directly, then I'm not sure that we can say we can actually find out what will truly benefit people.
Fantastic, thank you. Jason?
What Amy said.
Very succinct, thank you.
I come from a IT, specifically user interaction background, and I wholeheartedly believe that speaking to your users, working out what people want so that you can design for them not designed for you. In the end, we are working for the public, the general good, to make things a better place. So we need to speak to them to work out what they want. And as a general rule, if data is not sensitive, is not identifiable, it should be able to be released to the public.
Great, thank you. All right. In terms of the next question, I guess, here we are with COVID and so on, and we've been a bit more locked down, and we're not out there as much. But I'm interested to think broadly on a global basis about what we might be able to learn from international government efforts to democratize our public data assets. And I'll leave this open for anyone who thinks they'd like to jump in and have a comment if you are aware of any progress that you think is relevant. Yes, Amy? Yep.
Spiel's probably quite quick, unless, well, somebody else will say something amazing and then I'll want to jump in. But I would say we may want to be a little careful about the term democratize, just from a personal perspective here, because there are all kinds of countries that do release open data and do this kind of civic work. But yes, in terms of improving access to data and improving people's ability to make decisions and to make decisions together, I would say that there's been some amazing work done, for example, around COVID, funnily enough, with a whole bunch of organizations around the world suddenly thinking, oh gosh, we need to be able to share data with each other, to access it and to make it available. I know that's happened here. It's definitely happened overseas. I couldn't give you specific names, but I know every country's been talking about it, that I've been following. I did want to call out some specific examples of this. So there is, of course, the Open Data Charter happening overseas. I guess we're overseas to y'all, so there's definitely been stuff happening here as well in government around COVID and sharing data better. There are things like the Policy Plus initiative. For people who are not familiar with that, go and have a look at that. That's really interesting. There's also something really interesting. It's a document that was released towards the end of last year called The Third Wave of Open Data. And I really do suggest that as a great read, because it talks about, well, we now are approaching or into the third wave of open data, depending on the organizations and the countries and their maturity. And this is about really bringing the private sector into the mix as well. So it's not just about government. It's saying, how can we get the private sector involved as providers as well as users? And what does that look like so that we can further empower our various countries? Because as we know, the private sector holds a lot of really fantastic data. So how can we get them to sort of give back and get involved as well? I'd also say, and this is a quick one, is, for those of us in ANZ, we are part of the Global South. And I think that sometimes we do tend to look to Global North countries. We look to the Canadas, the Englands, the States, and I would say there is phenomenal work going on in the Global South, and it's worth forming bonds with the people who are doing that as well.
If I could just offer a slightly not different perspective, but just I guess a variation on the theme. One of the things about release of data is that there's typically concern about release of personal information with data, and it holds people back. And in the early days of Australia's open data journey, we used to compare ourselves and the number of data sets we released to the US and to the UK, and were found somewhat wanting just in terms of total volume. But the data sets that people were willing to put out were data sets that didn't really offer a lot of utility, simply because there was a real concern about how much personal information, or if there was any potential for personal information being released. I think that the thing that really changed during COVID was the balance shifted in terms of the desire to put data out of high quality and high utility. And there was essentially an acceptance of there being a different set of circumstances. One of the things that has been really interesting is to look at the level of personal information or the level of utility of the data sets which have been released. There was some great work done by a gentleman called Adam Berry from the University of Technology, where he looked at all of the different policies that were applied in different parts of the world and was able to map them to a New South Wales/Australian context. And as we were running COVID a couple of weeks behind the rest of the world, we could actually see what different sorts of restrictions did and what impact they had. And it was amazing work that essentially gave us a 2-week projection. And that was really pulling in lots of different open data from different parts of the world and mapping of Australian context. One of the things that I hope that happens now going forward is that greater understanding of just how much we impact the utility of open data by protecting it to the point that it's not that useful, and being able to try to quantify a little better what that threshold is that we're willing to accept for different sort of data in different circumstance, and have now in the future a much greater emphasis on utility of the data that we release.
Fantastic, excellent.
I did have one very quick thing. So one thing that I didn't know, and I found out last night when I was having a look into this area, that there is actually a UN working group on open data. The chair of it is New Zealand. Australia is also on it. So this is an area where Australia and New Zealand are taking a lead in working with open data and trying to encourage other countries to come into the open data sphere with us. So that's something that I should have known, but I only found out last night.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd like to continue on with the topic around risk, and we just talked about the balancing point around the quality of information and the protections and the utility of information. Are there any further comments around, as we're starting to get multiple data sets out there and the potentials around identifying individuals, how we can overcome risks as more data sets open up? Are there any further comments in that direction?
So at the risk of talking about standards and trying to keep people awake, there's some really interesting work, which is actually now led by Australia within the world of JTC1. There's a new working group which has been created looking at data sharing and use, and it's doing some fundamental things around terminologies and use cases, which brings us to sort of a more level playing field. But it's also looking at quantification of that personal information factor in linked to the identified data sets. So that possibility of creating a measure of personal information certainly is something which is quite tantalizing, and some work done in Australia over the last couple of years has produced a basic tool, the PIF tool, Personal Information Factor tool, which is now being picked up by Data61, Australia's National Science Agency, CSIRO, Data61, and they're progressing that work to see whether or not it's really possible to create a very useful measure of personal information. And the exciting thing about that is it means that if this tool can be developed to the point of really being genuinely applicable and useful, then we can start to think quite differently about the total ecosystem of data which is out there, and essentially the temperature rise or the level of personal information rise, or that total ecosystem information in much more systematic ways. So it's relatively early days, but I can send some links to the existing work that was done under the banner of the Australian Computer Society. But as mentioned, the Data61 folks have picked this up and started running with it.
All right, thanks, Ian. That's extremely interesting. Any further comments on this topic? No, I'll move on. Just interested to know too, what are some ways that we're trying to quantify our return on investment, we being you in this particular context, to our efforts with open data? So how do we quantify return on investment around our effort with open data? Anyone? Yes, sorry, I should have said anyone free to jump in. So Amy, yes.
Jump in quickly. I mean, this is always a really tricky thing with open data, because the effects can be systemic and complex and removed by multiple degrees of order from their original work. So it's always a really tricky one. Some of the things that we have found start to work is building case studies, and again that ongoing engagement with users, so that you can see. So you can talk with them about what they want, what they're doing, how it's making their lives easier, all of that sort of thing. That is qualitative, and that's okay as well. One doesn't necessarily have to have everything be purely quantitative. A lot of human experience isn't. necessarily. You can also look to situations at the broader, industry levels, is how improved access to information has affected industry growth, for example, or industry change or industry evolution. And another thing is one can look internally. So how has opening data, for example, it either changed or ideally potentially reduced the number of OIA, Official Information Act requests, or how has it relieved some of the volumes to call centers and data services teams as people are looking for specific pieces of data or have questions about it? Those things can really strongly measure into ROI. But I think sometimes if one's looking at wider indicators like well-being and things, if one knows that one's working to help benefit users in ways that they want, there is your ROI to some extent.
Great, thank you. Yep. Any other comments?
I think it really does come back to that point of utility. I mean, some of the best data sets that have been released, at least by New South Wales, relate to transport and Opalcard, the tap on, tap off, until the COVID data came along. And now every single day we release COVID data at postcode level with the date, likely source of infection, and a whole range of other fields. And we actually use the early version of that personal information factor, that PIF tool, to try and understand how much information we were releasing and also look at that total release of data. But that data was taken up and used quite extensively. And it's challenging to get a return on investment from something like release of COVID data. But what's really the whole objective of it is about building trust. This is what's going on in your neighborhood. And it's driving the intangible of trust and transparency. Whereas Opalcard data and Opal data in general, released to a whole series of different apps, has led to things like the TripView and the TripAdvisor, which, again, there's an economic return for the developers of those apps. There's also a great public service that comes from it, which is much, much more intangible. And efforts to quantify the benefit of or the impact of traffic congestion often come to numbers which are in the billions. But the economic benefit of making your bus on time for an entire population, for an entire city, is almost certainly going to be a very large number, but a little tricky to quantify. But it's certainly clearly valuable for both economic benefit and the intangibles of trust building and transparency.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left. There is a question on the floor, and I'll just grab part of it here. There's just some interest in understanding a little bit more about Indigenous open data. Let me just, the implications of Indigenous data sovereignty and open data. I was wondering, Amy, if you might be able to talk to that just for a moment.
This may sound like a cop-out, but that is an absolutely enormous question. So thank you. It's
fair enough. In 20 seconds, thank
you. That is
yes.
the subject of books, PhDs, yeah, ongoing discussions. But I would say there is a heap of really interesting stuff out there on the interwebs about it. And if you would like to know more, I'm sure you can contact the organizers or any of us, and we'd be very happy to point you to further links.
Fantastic, thank you. Look, do you each have a 20-second closing comment you'd like to make about anything that you think people would like to hear about before I wrap up?
My 2 cents worth is that data, COVID has been great for data. Terrible to have a pandemic, but it's been absolutely brilliant in terms of our understanding of the value of data, our understanding of the value of insights. What we're hoping to do in New South Wales is capture some of that ground, bake it into our strategies going forward. But to that point of not only the value of data, but also understanding the limitations of it, the importance of the quality of data as being a major driver and actually being useful, and constantly looking at the utility of data. And that is one of the big measures we'll look at as we start to push data out in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. Amy?
Be that, everything that's already been said, and also a huge thank you to the other panelists, and in fact to all of you, including you, Sam, and the organizers. I would say that my takeaway here is that no organization, no sector, no country can access every mind on earth in order to help sort of tackle some of the huge challenges and opportunities that we face over the coming decades and century, from climate change to improved transport to anything you can think of. However, open data does allow us to access potentially every mind on planet Earth and beyond, if you believe those things. So if you're interested in open data, please get involved. If you want to use it, if you do use it, if you have no idea what it is but would like to learn, if you think that what is done already is suboptimal and you have ways that you think it could be improved, please get involved. We tend to be all over the internet, and I'm sure you'll find wherever you are, there'll be other people that you can hook in with. I'm sure we'd all love to hear from you and, sort of hashtag better together on this one.
Fantastic. Very quickly, Jason, we've got to wrap up, but any comment?
Use open data, explore open data. Thank your data custodians for releasing the open data and making it available for use. They put a lot of work into making the data available, so make sure you thank them, and it may encourage them to release more.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'd like to thank you all. It's been an exceptional discussion. It's been a great quality of conversation. I've certainly reflected on the life cycle perspective around the needs around strategy, framework, data governance. That's always an important reminder. And yes, standards, I always like to talk to those two, and they are critical. The importance of talking with the public and users, publishing with purpose, and really a whole lot about that balancing around protecting of the protection of data and the utility where we're going, and that there are opportunities too in times of crisis. And I guess we want to think about the bright future that lies ahead with open data, and that there's a wealth of information that's been discussed here. And you could probably get in contact with the organisers of this group if you need to get some help getting in touch with the panel members. So to get that information. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. And I really thank the audience too for coming along. Thank you.